Greetings from Jacksonville, Florida. I am Dr. Letitia Reeves Henry, and I'm excited to be sharing with you this morning, First Baptist Capitol Hill. I thank God for each of you who are going to engage in listening to and prayerfully being lifted by this message. And so we just pray that God will meet us in the midst of this message in order that we may hear from him, that we may be changed and transformed, inspired, and able to rightly apply the word to live the abundant life that God has for us. So that is my prayer. Wanted to just seed this moment with that prayer even before we are started. I want to just bring greetings from Jacksonville, Florida, on behalf of my pastor, where I serve in my local church here, Dr. Eugene W. Diamond at Abyssinia Missionary Baptist Church, and to bring greetings from my family, my husband, my daughter, and from Dare to Be You, creative coaching outreach ministry. And so I want to make sure that you know that anytime that the Lord sees fit, and I'm called upon, gladly I share. It is an honor, as Dr. Kelly Miller Smith Jr. is my father in ministry, and licensed, ordained me into ministry, specifically preaching ministry. But even more than that, it is because of Pastor Smith that I fell in love with the Word of God. He is the first person to ever challenge me to read my word. First preacher I ever heard to say, don't take my word for it, read it for yourself. And hearing that week after week created in me and birthed a love for the Word of God. And so I am ever grateful to him for that, and for helping to equip and challenge and cultivate the gift of sharing the word through preaching ministry and teaching, and even for understanding the call to ministry. And so I am grateful for that. And so I am honored today to be able to share the word with you. We're going to be coming from the Gospel of Matthew today. Matthew's Gospel, the 14th chapter. The Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter. I'm going to be reading from, this is the New King James Version. And so want to give you the scripture reference, Matthew 14, beginning at verse 22. Matthew's Gospel, the 14th chapter, beginning at verse 22 down to verse 33. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is a very familiar text to most of us who have spent some time in the Lord's house, who have spent some time in Sunday school. It's a familiar text. And one of the things that is always important to know is that it doesn't matter how many times we've heard it or read it, that God can still bring a revelation and give us a word that will strengthen us and encourage us. And so this is the text about Peter walking on the water, becoming fearful because of taking his eyes off of Jesus, looking at the wind and the waves. Certainly, we see that in the text. But I want to bring to us more, offer to us. I believe the text has more to offer than just simply that. And so I want to talk today a little bit about the impact of the storms. The impact of the storms. There is something about a storm. Something about a storm that causes us to become anxious. We don't like storms. As soon as we begin to think about a treacherous storm, we become anxious. We become overwhelmed at times by the idea of a storm. As a matter of fact, one of the things that grabs me, being a native of Knoxville, Tennessee, and being a transplant here in Jacksonville, Florida, is the response to storms. Because in Knoxville, we had thunderstorms, we even had snowstorms, but we never had a hurricane. And so being in Jacksonville, Florida, hurricane season happens every year. And so the threat, the awareness of a storm that is being anticipated causes people to respond. It's a call to action as soon as there is a hurricane that is named and forecasted to be moving in this direction. People immediately will begin to go to the stores. They will grab up as many waters and non-perishables as they can afford to make sure that they have everything they need, just in case the worst case scenario happens. Because that's what happens in our minds when we hear of a storm. We think worst case scenario. And so the thing about it is that in this particular text, we can see that it was in the mind of the disciples when they were facing the storm as well. But before we even get there, it's something that's ironic about this text. We find at this time the disciples and Jesus have just come from this mountaintop experience. Jesus has just finished feeding the 5,000 with those 2 fish and those 5 loaves. And he took little and made it much, because that's what God does. After all, Jesus is able to take our little and make it much. And after he has fed the 5,000, now the crowd is being dispersed. It says immediately that Jesus tells his disciples that they need to get into the boat and go to the other side. And he is dispensing the people to go home. Immediately, that implies that there was an urgency about movement. There was an urgency, the urgency of now to do exactly what God said immediately. And so they were not to pass go. They were not to waste time. They were to immediately respond to what Jesus said. And they did. They got in the boat. And Jesus made them get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. They were anticipating that they would meet Jesus on the other side, and they were in the boat. The thing about it that's ironic is that he didn't give them a choice. He commanded them, literally in the original language, he commanded them to get into the boat. Because sometimes we just don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. If we're going to be obedient to what God says, we've got to move when God says move. We got to move when God moves, just like that. And this is what we see the disciples doing, because sometimes it is in the obedience that the will of God is revealed. It is in our obedience to what God is saying that the will of God is revealed in our lives. And so the disciples get into the boat just as Jesus tells them to, and they are on their way to the other side. They are watching the others being dismissed, even as they have left the shore and they are on their way to the other side. Before they run into the storm, they've seen the others being dismissed. They know the others get to go home, but they've been commanded to go to the other side. Isn't that something? I don't know about you, but in my sanctified imagination, it's something about the fact that they've been walking with Jesus. They've been working with Jesus. They've been faithful to do what Jesus has instructed them to do, and they are by his side. They've seen the miraculous. They've seen the challenges, and they are walking with Jesus. They left everything to follow Jesus and to do what he says, and they are doing exactly what they have been commanded to do, what they've been instructed to do, and they are watching the others get to go home. The others are being released to go home, and yet they are on their way to the other side and to meet Jesus to do more ministry. Now, they've been with Jesus, and those who have benefited from the ministry get to go home and go about their lives, business as usual. But the disciples are on their way to the other side. You said, well, preacher, that doesn't seem like much to me. Yeah, it may not seem like much until you realize that you're on the boat and you have been commanded to go to the other side. You've been following Jesus. You've been doing what he says. You've been obedient to the task. You've been doing the work of ministry, and boom, here comes the storm. Here comes the storm. You were doing exactly what Jesus said do, and here comes the storm. Everybody else is on their way to the house, but you are on the boat in the middle of the sea, in the midst of a storm. Everybody else had gotten to go home. Everybody else had gotten to go about life as usual, but you, following Jesus, doing what he has instructed you to do, walking out in obedience, the call to ministry, the call to serve, the call to follow him. And you run into a storm. Oh, my sanctified imagination, maybe it's just me. Maybe you don't think this way, but there is something about following Jesus. There is something about leaving everything and making the sacrifice. There is something about giving up my will for his will and still having to go smack into the middle of the storm. They made their way from the mountaintop experience, walking with Jesus, seeing the miraculous, watching him do amazing things that they had never seen before, having given up everything that they knew in order to follow him. And now they're commanded by him, and it leads them into a storm. Sometimes we're challenged. What do you do when following Jesus leads you into a storm, leads you into the midst of the storm, when you're watching everybody else and it looks like everybody else is going along business as usual and you are led by Jesus into the midst of the storm? One thing that we can gather from that is if Jesus leads us into the storm, he does not plan to leave us there. They were led into the storm, but we've got to recognize that sometimes the storm is the way to your next. Jesus told them to go on ahead of him and that he would surely meet them. So they knew that they were going to meet Jesus on the other side. They knew that Jesus was going to be with them. They did not know that the storm was coming, but Jesus did. Jesus knows before the storm comes that the storm is coming. The text says that Jesus went to the mountain to pray. And that by the time Jesus had come to them, it was the fourth watch. It was the darkest part of the day. It was just before daybreak. It was the fourth watch. It was late. It was hours that had passed in the battling of the storm, in the tossing and the battering of the waves that they would have had to endure. And the text indicates in the original language that they were crying out for fear when they saw Jesus approaching them in the midst of the storm. Listen, sometimes we don't like storms. We don't like the way they make us feel because we have no control of the storm. We don't know when the storm is coming, and we certainly don't know when the storm is ending. And so we don't like the storm. But sometimes the storm is the way to your next revelation, your next level of truth, your next promotion, the next growth spurt in your life, in your ministry, in your business. Because storms help to generate movement. We don't like the storm, but we don't recognize that the storm is actually helping us. Sometimes the storm is the way to your next. That was the way to their next. To the next place, to the next assignment. The storm was carrying them, but they did not know it. All they knew is that they were in the midst of a storm and they had no control. The waves and the winds were tossing them to and fro. The waves were battering against the ship. They thought that the storm would destroy them, but because God is always fully aware of what's going on in the storm, listen, he knows that the storm is not going to destroy you, but the storm he is using is going to make us better. Sometimes the storm is the way to your next. As a matter of fact, I remember as a little girl, I hated storms as well because I hated the sound of the storm. It was the sound of the storm and the lightning flashing that caused me to pause and to be fearful. So much so that I would run and find my mother or run and find my grandmother because I wanted to hide from the storm. But the truth of the matter is there is no hiding from the storm. And God alone knows what God will produce from the storm. I remember falling asleep. One night I fell asleep. This was several years ago. I fell asleep with the television on. Television was on, fell asleep, woke up in the middle of the night. And when I woke up in the middle of the night, there were several scientists that were on television. When I had fallen asleep, and the channel was on one of the inspirational Christian channels. And I woke up to a group of scientists explaining the positive impact of storms. The positive impact of storms. So literally, a storm in the earth has redeeming properties that we don't even know about. We fear the storm, but the storm is working something that we don't even understand. And what they were discussing is that when a storm happens, the lightning that strikes causes a chemical reaction in the atmosphere. And the lightning striking and the H2O, the water that is in the air, the lightning striking, the components of lightning coupled with the H2O produces the same types of chemical reaction and gases that are in fertilizer, which causes the replenishing and the growth and new life of things in the earth. And so I know you hate the storm. I know that storms make you uncomfortable. They make me uncomfortable as well. But one thing that blessed my soul was to find out that even though the storm is uncomfortable, it's in the storm that God is replenishing. It's in the storm that God is causing growth to occur that we don't even know about. And so a storm does not come to kill you. A storm, God does not send it to take you out. God is using it to grow you and to develop you. God is working on something even in the midst of the storm. The storm changes the atmospheric conditions in order that growth occurs supernaturally. Some stuff won't come except in the midst of the storm. Sometimes the storm is the way to your next. And then the other thing, I saw that Jesus told them to go on ahead of him to the other side, but he did not allow any of the crowd to go with him. It was just the 12. The great multitudes saw Jesus do the miraculous. The great multitude were able to witness him turn 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread into enough to feed thousands, but it's only the 12 that are assigned and commissioned and commanded to go to the other side. Because you see, the crowd cannot usher you to your next. The crowd cannot usher you to your next, and the crowd cannot accompany you. There are some things that we've got to do on our own. We've got to do it without the crowd. After all, going through a storm in the midst of the crowd might be a little bit more comforting than going through the storm with fewer numbers. But there are some parts of your journey that require fewer participants. Because when you're in the midst of a storm, you don't need a crowd. You don't need a crowd of people. You don't need the distraction and the many voices that could possibly lead you into temptation, that could possibly lead you to focus on the wrong thing. In the midst of the storm, we need to be able to focus on the one who has the power to calm the storm. And so those who were selected for service, those who were the called, those who were the ones who were to serve and turn the world upside down, were the ones who were chosen to go and to endure the storm. Think it not punishment. Storms of life come because storms happen. Life happens. Think it not punishment. Just recognize that God is doing something, working something, even in the midst of the storm. Because the storm is what gets us to our next. We didn't ask for the storm. We didn't know the storm was coming. We can't control the storm in the midst of it. We don't even know when the storm will end. God alone knows that. And we also don't know what the storm will produce. But we know that God is working something and that every storm produces growth if we allow it to and we live in the presence of God and walk according to the Spirit of God. In His grace, He will cover us. By His power, He keeps us in the midst of the storm until we get to the next. Whether it's the next storm or the next level, who knows? But God is always working in the midst of the storm. Those who were selected, those who were called out, they were chosen. They were chosen to recruit and to retrain, to reconcile as ambassadors for Christ. These are they who turned the world upside down. Certainly, they had to understand how to be able to navigate a storm in order to do the great work that God had for them to do. The storm was necessary. The beautiful thing about it is that the storm does not have the final say. It is the one who walks on the water that has the final say in every storm. And although they had walked with Jesus and worked for Jesus, although they were friends of Jesus, and they were His community and family, they had seen and experienced the miraculous, they still didn't know all that there was to know about Jesus. And it wasn't until they experienced Him in a storm that they recognized that He had power over the storm. Jesus went to pray, and they were in the storm, and they felt like they were alone. They felt like they would perish in the storm. But the one who chases storms, the one who controls storms, the one who speaks to the winds and the waves, and they have to obey, met them in the midst of the storm. Jesus will never leave you in the midst of the storm. You don't always see Him. You don't always know that He's there. You can't always sense His presence. Sometimes it feels like we're alone. But what we see in this text is that when Jesus knows there's a storm, that He's right there in our midst. And so the disciples, they look up. They are crying out. They are fearful. They believe that they will be overcome. They have been overwhelmed by the power of the storm. They are very afraid. And then they see in the distance one who is walking. One who is walking and coming to their rescue. They are so afraid because of the battering of the storm. They are so afraid because of the tossing by the wind and the waves that they don't recognize who Jesus is. And you know, I've heard this preached and so many times we're so hard on the disciples. But the truth of the matter is they had never seen anybody walk on water. They had never seen anybody defy gravity that way. They had never seen it done. And so when they see the shadowy figure of someone approaching them in the darkest of night, in the hour where it's the darkest part of the day, where they are fearful for their lives and they think they are about to be overcome and torn apart by the storm. They see someone approaching them. And we say, well, they should have known what Jesus looked like. Yeah, but it's the darkest part of the day and they've been in the storm. Yeah, they've been in a storm, tossed to and fro by the wind and the waves. They think they're about to be torn apart. They're extremely afraid. They're in a hysterical state, right? They are overwhelmed with fear. And here comes somebody walking on the water. Now, looking at this story from the other side of the cross, that we are able to pick up our Bible and read it, we think they should have known who Jesus was. But I declare, that's what my grandma says, I declare, if I would have seen somebody, as a matter of fact, if I see somebody walking on water, I'm going to have to second guess it today. Because folks just don't go around walking on water, right? And so they were fearful because they had never experienced anybody walking on water. They'd seen Jesus do the miraculous, but they never saw him walk on water. So they were afraid, and they did not recognize right away that it was him because they'd never seen anybody walk on water. Plus, we have to account for the fact that culturally, for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, those who were sailors would often have superstitious tales about what would happen if they experienced storms and turmoil on the seas, that there would be strange hallucinations and sightings. And so they thought it was a ghost. They thought it was a ghost. They were not aware that it was Jesus who was with them in the midst of their storms, that he heard their cry and he was responding to their prayers. But that's just like Jesus. In the midst of turmoil, in the midst of trials, in the midst of tribulations, he is always responding to our heart's cry. Even when we're fearful, even when it seems as if he does not hear us. Grandma said it like this: he may not come when you want him, but he's right on time. And so Jesus shows up in their midst. And Peter, who is always impulsive, but I love the fact that even though he's impulsive, he's also a man of faith. Because he says, if it's you, Jesus, tell me to come. And Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat. Peter, the impulsive one, the one who cuts off ears, the one who cusses and denies him 3 times. Peter, the one who seemingly messes up, the one who speaks out of turn. Peter, the one who is imperfect, just like us, is the one who responds. Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come. And he gets out of the boat because he hears the voice of Jesus. Yes, he's impulsive. Yes, he's imperfect, but he follows the voice of Jesus. And I love that this helps us to understand that God is not looking for perfection. Jesus came because he already knew that we were not perfect. He knew we needed a savior, but he still tells us to come. Even in our imperfection, he tells us to come. Even when we don't cross all the T's and dot all the I's, he bids us to come. And so we see Peter walking on water. Because if you're going to do something for Jesus, you might as well go on and take the risk. Respond to his voice and do the uncommon. Just as Peter did. We don't read anywhere else where anybody else responds to the voice of Jesus and walks on water. But Peter does, even with all of his imperfections, because he heard the voice of Jesus and decided boldly to respond. What we can learn from this text is that what you hear, whether you're on the mountain or in the valley, whether you're in the storm of life and challenges are overwhelming, whenever Jesus speaks and we respond, God is able to do the uncommon in our lives. Jesus speaks to Peter. Peter walks on the water. The text says that Peter then hears the crashing and the dashing of the waves. He becomes fearful and he begins to sink. The disciples are watching all of this. They are terrified. They are disillusioned. They are still distressed. And now they are experiencing shock. They're in awe. First of all, that Jesus was walking on the water, and then that Peter was walking on the water. And then Peter becomes afraid. And he begins to sink. Yes, Peter became afraid. Because it's one thing to experience the wind and the waves in the boat. It's another thing to experience the wind and the waves on the water. So we ought not be too hard on Peter, because water walking is hard. Doing the unusual is hard. Doing the uncommon is hard. And it's one thing to sit in the boat and criticize the one who has walked on the water. It's another thing to experience walking on the water. Peter was fearful because it was a fearful situation. But just like Jesus does in our lives, he reaches out because he hears the cry of the one who was impulsive, of the one who cuts off ears, of the one who curses and denies him. Jesus knew all of this before it would even happen, but Jesus responds to the voice of those who belong to him. And he responds to Peter. And as he responds to him, he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" He asked him a question so that he would think, but he did not harshly rebuke him to criticize him because he became afraid. It was a gentle reminder. Didn't you know I'd be with you? Didn't you know I was right here? You don't have to be overwhelmed by what you see around you, because I'm right here with you. And Jesus is speaking to us today that very same word. Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt that I could not heal you? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt that I could not bring you through? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt that I would not bring you to the finish line when I'm the one who told you to start? Oh, you of little faith, Why did you give up when I told you to hold on? Oh, you of little faith. And the scenario can go on and on for all of the things that we encounter and experience in our lives. God is always with us, always working in the midst of the storm. And because Jesus is always with us, as soon as he takes our hand and steps into the midst of our circumstances, we're made aware that he's in the midst of our circumstances with us. He can cause the storms, the winds, and the waves to cease. That's just like Jesus. That's just what he does. Because no matter the storm, the tribulation, or the trial, he is faithful in his dealings with us. So remember, no matter where you find yourself, no matter what the storm is, that he's with you in the midst of the storm. Remember that the one who led you into the storm is the one who will lead you out. Remember, the one who led you into the storm is the one who has power and control and authority over all the storms of life. And there is nothing that you and I can encounter that he does not have authority over. He's the storm chaser. He's the heart fixer. He's the mind regulator. He's the healer. He is our strong tower. The Bible tells us that the name of the Lord is a strong tower, that the righteous run into it and are safe. There is nothing that our God cannot do. If he leads you to a storm, don't despise the storm. Learn the lesson in the midst of the storm. Remember, there are some things that can only happen in the midst of the storm. Maybe the storm is leading you to your next. Maybe Jesus just wants to show you that he'll be with you always, no matter where you find yourself. Maybe he's simply trying to teach you that when he speaks, all things are under his authority. It wasn't until they were with Jesus in the midst of the storm that they got the revelation that he is the one who has authority over all things. Surely, yeah, I thought you were the Son of God. I've seen you do the miraculous, but now I've seen you cease the storms and you have authority over all things. Surely you are the Son of God. It is God who knows when the storm will begin, but he also knows when the storm will end. And he knows how to get you to your next, even through the storm. And that's the word of God for the people of God. Remember, the storm is producing a great work. And the storm produces growth. Be blessed. God be with each and every one of you.